Welcome to the second section of the Paleolithic art lecture. I'm going to subtitle this section Just the Facts. I want to say just the facts, ma'am. But that's probably because I watch too many cop TV shows. What we're going to be covering in this section of the lecture is parietal art. That is cave art. It's the stuff that we all know about in the Paleolithic art realm. It's the stuff of cartoons, it's the stuff of movies, it's the stuff of all the jokes about cave art. And rather than go through and have a fairly dry lecture where I list out every cave ever known, tell you about it, give you a bunch of facts, what I'm going to do is look at this much more generally. This is my tendency in class, so that you can take what you learn about certain objects and then apply that to the broader period. So if, for instance, they find a new cave next year, and you say, oh, wait, this cave is full of blank, blank, and blank, and that's like blank, blank, and blank, all of it's going to click in your head, and you'll have a greater understanding that you can apply to those new finds or other objects. And I'm going to do that throughout the class. Although I should note there are a few things that I will tell you have to know, and I will emphasize those specific objects because they are linchpins in art history. So the way I'm going to approach parietal art is through a series of questions, at least in this section, and they are going to be factual questions. We're going to start out with how were they made, and basically this is what is the medium of the art. There are two basic media of parietal art. There is the petroglyph. A petroglyph is when you take the stone of the cave wall and you remove part of the surface. So if you incise a line, if you scrape off what's called rock varnish, you end up with a petroglyph. It's what we call a subtractive process because something's being removed. A pictograph is an additive process. It is where pigment is added to the surface of the image to create an image. It's like drawing or painting. These two images show petroglyphs. In the upper image you see an area where part of the rock varnish has been removed, and you see the second color of the rock underneath. And in the other image you see basically something that's been incised into the walls of the cave. I want to focus a bit more on pictographs. What we're looking at here are lions from a cave called Chauvet. I'll talk about repeatedly through the lecture. And when you look at these and you think, if I were a Paleolithic person and I wanted to draw a picture, how would I go about doing that? Clearly, you can't go down to the local arts and crafts store and buy some charcoal or a pencil or some oil paint and some paper. Basically, you have to find or make whatever you're going to use to leave that image on the wall. Sometimes it's really obvious how they did this. And if you look at these lines from Chauvet, those dark lines look an awful lot like charcoal, which is a common drawing medium. And it's actually a medium that's really easy to make because all you have to do is stick a stick into some fire and you are going to create some charcoal. And that's very likely what these were made of. When you look at the hands from the Cuevos de los Manos in Argentina or the bull from Altamira, Spain, these were clearly not drawn with charcoal. And instead of looking like charcoal drawings, they look a bit more like something that was sprayed on. Now, when I was young and taking my first art history class, when they showed these images and they talked about how they were made, they talked about how you can chew on a stick and create a paintbrush, or use a feather to apply paint and stuff like this. It was very dissatisfying because these don't look like they were applied with any kind of paintbrush. In fact, they look like they were made with spray paint. And it was not until 1998 that someone said, hold on a minute, they very well could have been applied with spray paint. When we look around at these caves and we find little bits of minerals like ochre, which is a reddish brown color that appears in a lot of pictographs, often we find bones that are actually tubes next to them. And you can imagine, if here you are faced with some ochre, you want to use this as a pigment on your painting, the first thing you're going to have to do is grind it up. You might have a mortar and pestle that you've made. Maybe you found some rocks that fit together to grind it up. But the easiest way to grind something that you really need to grind is with your molars, which are basically mortars and pestles. Not that I recommend that, and my orthodontist is probably rolling over in his grave at this point. But Michel Lorblanchet grabbed a bunch of the types of minerals they used during the Paleolithic period to apply, or that they applied to the cave walls, and tried this out himself. And some of his results were quite startling. So it's very likely that when we look at the Paleolithic pictographs that have a sort of solid color area, what we're looking at is a type of painting that we would today call spit painting. We often name painting after the ingredients used in paint. You always need to have some kind of binder that's going to make the paint stick to the surface, and then you have a pigment, which is the ground up color that's being applied. In this case, the binder would have been saliva or spit. I have a friend who teaches in Wisconsin, and I'm always a little in awe of her because she teaches spit painting in her art history classes to middle schoolers. Actually, it's an art class with a little art history thrown in. But I can't even imagine teaching a bunch of 7th grade guys how to spit paint and expecting things to go well. Oh well. And I want to point out here, if you look at this Michel Lorblanchet painting, it is surrounded by earlier examples or attempts that are not very good. It is tempting to say, oh, way back in time they weren't as good at certain things as we are, or they weren't as good at things, period, as we are today. That somehow we are on this path of progress and everyone is better today than they were back in the Paleolithic age. Be very careful in thinking about that. And quite frankly, I have a feeling that if you took the 70 people in this class and you plopped them down in the Paleolithic world, most of us would be dead in a couple months. And I know, quite frankly, I would be dead. I would be eating some deadly berry pretty quickly. But, and I'm pretty sure I can't bring down a woolly mammoth. So, what I would like you to try to do is think about these works as accomplished works. And one of the ways you can do that is to think about the style of these artists. Paleontologists have gone through and assigned certain names to styles of art throughout Europe and other locations and pointed out sort of regional styles. But I'm going to approach this more generally. I, first of all, want to encourage you to think of these as accomplished works of art, as I said, and when you look at the cave bears from Chauvet Cave, which dates back to 30,000 BC, I look at this, and this is worthy of Disney animation. It's a really sensitive portrayal of a bear, and I am absolutely positive I will never make anything anywhere near as good as this. I know there's not a lot of detail, but this is a great image of a bear. Now, we can talk more specifically about Paleolithic styles. When you look at the bull from, or one of many bulls, I should say, from Altamira, one of the things that you might notice is, although it shows a bull that looks like a bull, it doesn't look exactly like a bull. And it doesn't even look exactly like a bull from the Paleolithic age. That bull has really skinny legs. And then it has this big, beefy front. And one of the things that is going on here is that the artists are playing with proportion a little bit. We don't know exactly what their intentions were, but there are two things that we can say about this. First of all, the fact that it's so big in the front gives it kind of a forward thrust, and that's what you are going to sense if a bull is running. And another thing is, those legs, those little spindly legs that could never hold up that body, when you see legs running, you don't see the full leg. So that might be how the leg appeared to them, and they sort of just translated that onto the wall. We're not quite sure. Maybe it was wishful thinking. They didn't want all those tendony, muscly legs, and instead they would rather have a big, huge bull that they could eat. I'm not sure. One of the interesting things about Altamira is that when you look at the panel that has a whole bunch of bulls in sight, as opposed to in these great photographs that we get, you notice that the artists were aware of all the natural contours of the walls and very often used them. So if you look at the image of the bull, which is sort of curled around and sleeping in the middle, or on the right-hand side of this, you see that they've taken the contour of the wall that kind of pops out and creates a mound in order to show a bull. The bull that's to the far right, that sort of where his back is sort of diagonally down, there's a big bump there that they use to show the shoulders of the bull. So they're thinking not just on a two-dimensional plane, but also of the three-dimensionality of the cave wall itself. And here, hopefully, you can see the shadows below this sleeping bull, and how they really use that bump on the wall to create the sense of mass, the mass of the bull. More recently, people have started to think more about how the cave paintings were experienced by the people who went into the caves. And there is a theory that these paintings, when viewed by firelight, which flickers, were kind of an early animation. So Mark Azema has taken this image of a bull from Chauvet Cave that has 8 legs, thought about it in flickering light, and with the contours of the wall, and realized that you would basically only see 4 legs at a given time in the flickering light and with the angles. And so he shows in the lower 2 images which ones you would see. And if you think about this with the light that would be constantly moving from your torch, come up with kind of animation. Ta-da. Okay, so there's a little bit about style. I also want you to think about where these were found. What is the original site? And let's think really broadly at first. Basically, wherever there wasn't ice, if there were caves, we've found cave paintings. We haven't found them, or I should say we haven't found every single cave, but we have found caves in South America, in North America, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia, in Europe. Wherever people could inhabit, they were leaving parietal art. Perhaps more interesting is where in the structure of caves we find art. And what's interesting about that is that you would expect art to be in the places where people lived. At the mouth of the cave. You don't live deep in a cave, because if you start a fire back there, you will die of smoke inhalation. And we know where people lived in caves because they find midden heaps, which is basically the trash they left behind. Stuff like that. And the art is not there. The art is through teeny tiny openings that you have to crawl through, or down 16-foot drops in these places that are actually quite dangerous to get to. And just to give you a sense of how dangerous they are, I want to tell you the story of the discovery of these two caves. So, the first cave that was found in Europe with Paleolithic pictographs was the cave at Altamira. It was found in 1879. And there was this amateur archaeologist who would go out looking for the remains of early humanity, and he had a cave on his property, and he kept looking at the entrance of the cave where he expected people to be. And so he's looking around, and he brought his young daughter out there one day, and she was bored, so she sort of crawled deeper into the caves and said, "Oh, Dad, look at all these oxen." Because she saw the paintings that were, a mere 10 feet away, but as a middle-aged man with some kind of sense of danger, he would not crawl into that itty-bitty space that kids are wont to do. The caves at Lascaux were found in 1940 when a group of teenage boys were out in the woods. And I should note, some people are questioning this because there's some fishy stuff going on here, so we're not quite sure why they were out in the woods. But they said they were out in the woods and they lost their dog. And so they went looking for the dog, realized the dog had fallen down a shaft, and they went down the shaft after the dog, and they saw all these enormous paintings of bulls. So they went back to town and told the townspeople about those paintings. Teenage boys do a lot of things that people who are afraid of death don't do. More recently, some caves have been found, like Grotte Cosquer. Grotte Cosquer is really interesting because it's a cave that's actually partially underwater today. Keep in mind that in the Paleolithic period you had an ice age, and so there was less water, and the coastline was farther down. So there was actually a cave entrance that was right at the coastline. And today, to get to Grotte Cosquer, what you have to do is you have to go 36 meters, which is something in like 118 feet, down into the Mediterranean Sea, and then swim in 175 meters to get to the cave where there are paintings. And basically that's the kind of thing that you do if you're an extreme sports addict. Our lives have become comfortable enough now that we are willing to put our lives at risk just for a thrill, which probably beats chasing down a woolly mammoth for dinner. But the point I want to make is that these caves were dangerous to get to. And when we get into the theory, that's going to be one of the things that we're going to be interested in. We're puzzled. Why would someone risk their lives to make, say, a painting of a bull? Speaking of that, we should probably talk about the subject matter. What did the Paleolithic people represent in their pictographs and petroglyphs? The subject that we all know about is, of course, animals. I'm going to try to complicate that a little bit. It'll be pretty simple to understand, but we can go beyond just saying they painted animals. So the first two animals I'm showing you are from Chauvet Cave. These date to about 30,000 BC. In the upper one you see a leopard, and in the lower one you see some lions. Also from Chauvet Cave we find images of horses and rhinoceri. And what's interesting is that when we look at the specific dates of each type of animal, what we typically find in caves is that images of predators predate images of herbivores. So basically they were showing things that could kill them before they were showing the images of things that they hunted for food. If they were hunting those for food. We're going to get into that a little bit later. If you look at the caves at Lascaux, and I feel obliged to show you this most famous part of Lascaux, which shows the Hall of the Bulls. These are enormous, enormous images of bulls. I think they're about 5 meters long, so over 15 feet each bull here. And what's interesting is that there's also a part of the cave at Lascaux that shows large cats. They are petroglyphs that are kind of hard to see, so I've brought in an illustration instead of showing you the petroglyphs. Those predate the images of the herbivores by about 2,000 years. Another thing I want to point out about the animals that are shown in caves is that those animals were the animals of the region. So even though people were nomadic, what they were showing in the caves were the animals that they would have seen in that location. And Grotte Cosquer has been really instructive about this, because what we see at Grotte Cosquer are a number of animals that are aquatic. For instance, auks, they're an aquatic bird, kind of like a penguin or a puffin. And they also showed, we believe, jellyfish there. So animals were very common. Another thing that we find in lots and lots of caves that was not even mentioned for years and years and years by paleontologists are signs. And there are a lot of patterns that show up in lots and lots of caves. I'm not going to go into much detail about that. There are a lot of people who will theorize about what each sign or symbol shows. But I'm very interested in semiotics, and without some kind of backup language or reference to the culture, it is really, really a guessing game when you talk about what signs or symbols mean. What I can say is you'll see lots of incised lines, you'll see lots of dots on cave walls, and they appear to be purposely put there. Another thing that they represented was hands. And typically those images of hands would take either a kind of image of a stencil. They would literally put a hand down and then paint around it, or a stamp where they would put the pigment on the hand and press it onto the wall. And here are these spectacular hands from it's called the Cave of the Hands in Argentina. But those appear, as I mentioned, all over the world, images of hands. Finally, you have images of human figures. Those are fairly rare. You have far fewer images of human figures than of animals or hands. I know those are parts of humans, but we're talking about the whole thing. And far fewer images of human figures than you have signs in caves. The images of human figures tend to take a couple forms. You have lots of images of women, and sometime of people coupling. The images of people tend to stress things that have to do with reproduction or women. And here's just one little area of Chauvet Cave where there's a part that hangs down, and they took that part and painted two female legs, or two legs, and an enormous vagina. It really appears that the images of people were stressing reproduction. There are also some images of people that are sort of a morphing of human and animal parts. The term that gets applied to this very often is shaman, which is based on later religious stuff. But I just wanted to show you one image. And if you go back to that image from Odura Cave, you'll see someone who appears to be part lion and part human. Now at this point, I've given you a lot of information. And usually when I'm in an on-campus class and I look at the group of people sitting there in front of me, they're sort of like shocked and stunned, and they're like, what are we supposed to be writing down? What do we have to know? So I give them a page of notes just to make sure that you're getting the basic information. And here is the page of notes that I show them, and at this point you should have either notes on this or some way of recording this. Your tests will be open book, open note in the online class, but there will be limited amounts of time. So you do want to have notes in the class and want to make sure that you're processing the information. It's going to be easier to process the information if you take notes, because there's something about the human mind that when they see something and when they hear something, they might get it, but they are far more likely to get it if they then think about it and have to put it down in their own words. Don't rely on a friend who's taking the class for their notes, because they're going to be the ones who is processing the information, and it's going to work better if you actually process it, put it into words, and put it down on paper. So at this point you can move on to the Paleolithic lecture part 3, where we'll get into a bit of the theory, sort of the why of all the aspects of parietal art that we've looked at so far.